In the first video for the chemistry review, we ended up taking a look at this idea of how are atoms held together in molecules that are out there. And if you look at the structure and you think about, well, is there a chance that protons and neutrons that are inside this inner location in the nucleus, are they going to be able to interact with things in the surrounding area easily? Probably not. What will be able to interact a little easier with other surrounding atoms is the electrons. And so what chemists have learned is these electrons, especially the ones orbiting on the outside, are really important for holding atoms together. And when they looked at the structure, they came up with sort of this model that it turns out your electrons actually orbit in different shells. You can almost think of it like there isn't enough room for another electron to fit in this area here. And the first shell that we're going to find here holds two electrons. And so if you try and put another electron in here, it's going to bounce off really because of that negative charge from the other electrons, and that electron is going to start orbiting in a separate shell over here, and this second shell can hold up to 8 electrons. And then outside of that, there's a third shell that holds another 8 electrons, and outside of that, there's a fourth shell that holds another set of electrons. And the reason I go into this isn't because I'm evil. It's more because if you look at this, it turns out that atoms who have their outer shells filled are going to be more stable. And when you look at this, these outer electrons are known as valence electrons. Those are what's actually going to be involved in forming these bonds between these atoms that we find in different molecules and compounds that are out there. And so if you look at this figure, again, you can see some of the different features of the atomic structure for the pictured elements there. And if you look at hydrogen up here, you can see it's got 1 as the atomic number. So this guy just has a single proton with a single electron. And remember, when we looked at that previous diagram, that inner shell holds 2 electrons. So it turns out hydrogen is not happy just by itself. It wants to do something with other electrons, and that's going to make it more stable. Some of the other things, if we look at our CHON, there's your carbon. It's got 6 electrons orbiting that nucleus right there, with your 6 protons and your 6 neutrons. The first shell holds 2, and then your second shell is going to hold 4. And remember, that can pack 8. So there is some room for more electrons in here. And likewise, when we go up to oxygen and nitrogen here, they're just one more higher up in terms of the atomic structure there. So there's your carbon, your nitrogen, and your oxygen at 6, 7, and 8 right there. And if we look at what these outer valence electrons can do in one form of a bond, we get what's known as an ionic bond. And here, your outer electron can actually get transferred from one atom over here to another atom to result in a filled shell over here and hopefully a filled shell over here. And remember, filled shells, those things are more stable. And when this happens, because you are losing a negative charge here and picking up a negative charge there, you end up with a charged atom, and those charged atoms are known as ions. And a good example of this is something that we are all familiar with, table salt. Table salt is composed of 2 elements that are there, sodium and chlorine, and they're going to be able to form an ionic bond when they share an electron and the 2 atoms are attracted to each other. And if you look at this, it totally makes sense if you can visualize this structure right here. Sodium has 11 electrons right there. So you break that down. 2 electrons in the first shell, 8 electrons in the second shell, and the third shell has got 1 single electron. This is not as stable as it could be. It's more stable if it loses that outer electron. And you've got chlorine over here, and notice it's 2, 8, and then 7. It's got space for 1 more electron right there. And so this atom is actually going to donate, and your sodium will donate 1 electron from that outer shell, and it'll go over here to this chlorine atom. And now for both of these atoms, their outer shell is going to be filled up right there. And if you look at your sodium ion, because it's lost that electron, it has a positive charge right there. your chloride ion over here has that extra electron, and because you've got these two charges to the atoms, they're going to behave kind of like a magnet, where you will get attraction between the positive and the negative charges because they're opposite. And so that's how we get the formation of an ionic bond right there, because the ions are literally attracted to each other and they will stick together. And this bond can be broken, but it is a relatively strong bond there. And just so you can see, there's some common kinds of ions floating around out there in microbiology that we run into over and over, especially when we look at what are you eating and what are you pooping out there for the cells. So you can see there's your sodium and your chloride, even something like hydrogen, and these carbonates that are out there, and the phosphates and sulfates. So a lot of different ions are going to play a role when we look at different organisms, because remember, with microbes, these aren't something that can travel easily. They don't have arms, they don't have legs, they don't have wings. They're traveling at the whims of the planet, really. And so they're going to have to live on the environment for what's available. And so a lot of them have adapted to use these different ions here. Another kind of bond that we can find out there is covalent bonds. And you can see my crappy little drawing over here. What I'm trying to show is if you take these atoms and instead of donating an electron, what if you share an outer valence electron? So imagine these electrons right here are actually circling around both of these atoms right here. So imagine this is hydrogen and this is hydrogen. Remember, one electron is going around this atom and one electron is going around this atom. Well, what if those two atoms can share those electrons and you get this sort of figure eight going around and around and around? And when you look at covalent, the name literally tells you co is kind of the idea of jointly. So if you think about this, these atoms are jointly sharing their outer valence electrons there, and that's causing these two atoms to stick together with a pretty strong bond. We can look at another example of this out there. If you take that hydrogen again with the one electron, it's got one spot available in that first shell, and you take carbon over here, it's got 6 electrons. So break it down, 2 electrons in the first shell and then 4 electrons in the second shell. It's got 4 spots in that second shell. And if you can visualize this thing again when we're looking at this, and you look at covalent bonds that are out there, you can see that the molecule methane has a carbon right here, and then it's got 4 hydrogens that are sharing their electrons with the carbon. That's going to fill those outer shells for everything that's there. There's your 2, and there's your 8 going around there, and each of the hydrogens has got 2 electrons there. And these electrons, again, are swinging around here, and then coming around here, coming around here, so they are just constantly traveling around all of this between each of these different atoms that we can see right here. So it's really interesting, but you have to be able to visualize this idea for what's going on. And if we look at another version of these covalent bonds that are out there, we can see our water molecule right here. H2O has got the oxygen depicted in the center, and then the line right here is to indicate that there's a covalent bond between the oxygen and the hydrogen, and then this oxygen and the hydrogen also. So when you look at this thing, there's actually 2 covalent bonds between our atoms right there within the water molecule itself. And this brings up another interesting kind of feature, is that when you look at the sharing of these electrons, it actually depends on something that chemists call electronegativity. And this is really the measure of the attraction of an atom for the electrons. And the more electronegative your atom is, the more it's going to pull on the electrons with its nucleus. And when we look out there, what they've found is that oxygen and nitrogen are actually very electronegative elements. They exert a strong pull on the electrons that are out there. But when you look at something like our methane molecule in the previous thing over here with this little structure, carbon and hydrogen are not electronegative elements. And so these two elements don't tend to exert a pull on that, which means your electrons are spending equal times traveling all over the place here. So when we look at this idea of CHON out there, two of these atoms, carbon and hydrogen, are not electronegative, and those make up what are known as hydrocarbons. When you look at oxygen and nitrogen, though, they have that high electronegativity value. And so if you think about that, those electrons are going to spend more time orbiting around the oxygen or the nitrogen in a molecule. And when you have this, think about it, the electrons are spending less time over here and more time over here on this side of the molecule. Electrons have a negative charge. And that's going to end up giving us what's known as a partial charge that chemists like to designate with this delta right here. So this is partially negative on this side of a water molecule, and it's partially positive on the hydrogen ends right there. So when we look at this, hydrogen molecules are going to be polar as a result of this. That means water is going to behave like a little magnet. That covalent bond right there has some polarity associated with it. And when we look at this sort of idea of this polarity, that means hydrogen bonds can actually form between molecules that are out there. And if you look at this, there is our simple little water molecule. It's got the partial negative and the partial positive right there. And when it forms a hydrogen bond, if we take a look at this, there's our covalent bond between the oxygen and the hydrogen. And remember, your electrons are circling around here doing that figure 8 right there. So there's strong covalent bond between these atoms within the molecule, but a hydrogen bond over here on this side, this is going to form between the partial positive and the partial negative on two different kinds of water molecules that are out there. And notice this water is oriented on two other ones. And then this one could be oriented on other ones. And the hydrogens it's oriented. So when you think about this, imagine this isn't very many hydrogen bonds that we can see here. But now you take a glass of water, and we're talking about this massive number of water molecules that are floating around in there. And they are constantly forming and breaking these hydrogen bonds. So these water molecules are sort of spinning around sort of randomly. And when they do form these hydrogen bonds, it tends to hold them in place for a little while. And then they break them and they continue to spin around. But we're talking about this huge, massive number of hydrogen bonds are constantly forming and breaking there. And when we look at this idea, this polarity of water molecules that is forming these hydrogen bonds, they actually give some unique properties to water that are going to have an effect on the living organisms that are out there. And that's what we'll finish up this part of the chemistry lecture looking at. Hydrogen bonds actually do make water ideal for life. And one property that happens is it turns out water is very sticky. It has what's known as cohesiveness. And you can see this if you take water and you put some beads of water on glass, it will bead up because the water is actually sticking to itself. And here we can see this little water strider can go across the surface because the top of the water here is sticky and it's basically walking on a semi-solid surface. And as long as it doesn't break through, it's going to be able to walk along there because the surface of the water is cohesive. And when you look at plants, they're basically little capillary tubes. And the water is sticky, so it'll stick to the sides of this tube, and that'll draw the water up. And that's how plants can transport liquids without needing a heart. We can also find that water is going to resist temperature changes. And when you pump heat into this, you break these hydrogen bonds that are out there. So it requires extra heat energy in order to make these water molecules break hydrogen bonds and start to spin around. And so when you are sweating out here, you're doing what's known as evaporative cooling. And the sweat that is sitting right here is going to sit there until enough energy goes in to break these hydrogen bonds and to spin that water molecule enough that it can go off and change its state of matter from liquid to gas. And that energy is going to come off of you, and that means water is going to resist temperature changes. And because of that, we can use it to really give off excess heat right here, the same way that you could see for evaporative coolers or swamp coolers out there. Another feature of water that makes it ideal for life is that water floats when it's frozen. And again, this has to do with your hydrogen bonds. In liquid water, these hydrogen bonds are constantly breaking and reforming, like I talked about. But if you suck the energy out of here, those water molecules are going to get held in place because the hydrogen bonds are going to form all over the place. And when you have this, notice there is less water packed into the space because they're held apart, versus here the liquid water is sort of sprawled all over and spinning around, and that means frozen water is less dense. There's less water molecules in a given volume right there. And you think, well, who cares? Well, if you're a fish in the middle of winter, you care, because that means the top of the lake is going to float and the bottom of the lake is going to stay liquid. You can live in liquid water. It's harder to live in frozen water because everything shuts down. Although a lot of microbes can survive this, we tend not to do very well. When we look at the last feature of water that makes it really important for life, we have to remember that cells that we're looking at are going to be 70 to 90% water. Water is polar, and in chemistry, like dissolves like. And so if we look at this idea and put it in context, a solvent is a dissolving agent. So here you've got your little thing of water, and your solute is the substance that is dissolved in that agent. And here we have a chemical known as potassium dichromate. And when you mix this chemical in the dissolving agent or solvent, you're going to form a solution right here. And so this is our substances mixed together. And if we look at this, our original chemical over here, this is a chemical with covalent bonds, but it's also got ionic bonds between the potassium and the other part of the ions that are in there. And ions are going to dissolve really easily in water because water is polar. Ions have charge. And so the ends of these charges are going to coordinate between the water and the atoms. And if we look at this sort of picture, it helps to visualize there's a potassium chloride salt right here. Ionic bonds are holding these ions together and they're fixed in place, and that would allow the formation of a solid crystal. And then you take that solid crystal and you throw it into your solvent, your water, and those water molecules are going to orient. And notice the positively charged hydrogens are going to orient on the negatively charged ion right there. And those are partial positives, so we can get multiple ones to neutralize that. And that's why water is a really good solvent. It dissolves polar or charged compounds really easily because the water is going to shield both the positive and the negative charges. And here you can see these things are going to allow that ionic bond to break, and now you've got your solution with these two molecules mixed together. There are molecules out there that don't work very well, and so water doesn't dissolve everything. If you look at oil and water, they don't mix. And what we know about this is the oil must have something different about it. Like dissolves like. Well, oil must be unlike water. And it turns out, if you remember when I talked about oil, this fits into a category of hydrocarbons that are out there. And if you remember hydrogen and carbon, like methane, it forms nonpolar covalent molecules. And if you have nonpolar molecules, they don't dissolve easily in polar kinds of solvents like water that's out there. And so these oil molecules are what's known as hydrophobic. They are literally afraid of the water there. This is nonpolar, and then your water down here is polar. And so this will dissolve these charged compounds that are out there that are ions or things that do have these partial charges, and they will be able to dissolve easily in the water, but they don't mix well with the oil that's out there. And cells have taken advantage of some of these features out there and come up with a structure that is what's known as an amphipathic molecule. And think amphibians, like frogs, they like to be in water and out of water. Well, this kind of phospholipid bilayer structure that we find up making a semi-permeable barrier around the cells out there, that's an amphipathic molecule. The exterior of the cell for the environment is aqueous, so it's got water. The interior of the cell is aqueous, it's got water. And then this membrane, when you look at the structure of it, these little balls are the heads, and those are actually polar molecules. And those polar molecules are attached to fatty acid tails that are hydrocarbons. So you've basically got a two-part molecule that assembles so that the inside of your membrane is hydrophobic. This is the part that is afraid of water, although other hydrophobic molecules can dissolve well in this layer right here. So things like oils and steroids would dissolve in there. But on the outside here and the inside of the cell, it's a watery environment. So your ions are going to dissolve well. But ions, when they're floating around, when they run into this structure, are going to bounce off. So that's why I said it's a semi-permeable. Some things can get through here, but this really tends to serve as a barrier to a lot of molecules out there.